Hi everyone, this is Sarah from the Relative Future, here to give you a content warning for this week's episode of Questioning Behaviour. In this episode, we're going to be talking about sexual harassment. We take an academic tone rather than discussing personal experiences, but this is just a warning. If this is a subject that you'd rather stay away from, we completely understand. For those of you who carry on listening, we do hope you enjoy the episode.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of Questioning Behaviour. Today we're actually questioning gender equality within the labour market.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying.
Very quick disclaimer before we dive into that. This episode might be a bit less behavioural sciencey and a bit more, well, actually based on gender equality. So if you're here for the behavioral science stuff, this episode might be catering a bit less to you than normally. But if you're interested in any of this stuff, which I think you should be because it's really interesting, then please just stay tuned.
Yeah, and today actually we're going to be talking with a researcher who is doing some incredibly interesting research in the field of economics to do with gender inequality. But there is a sort of a behavioural mechanism underlying lots of the interesting results that she finds. So if you are interested in behavioural insights, then here's an example.
So gender inequality in the labour market. Sarah, you and I are going to end up on the labour market relatively soon. Are you worried?
I would say it's something that I am conscious of, but I feel like, well, there's not much in my control to change it. So what can I really do? I think that there is, in academia particularly, I mean, that's where we are at the moment, there is a lot of very salient power dynamics. And I think that sometimes that isn't necessarily very healthy for the way that women are necessarily treated, especially in fields like economics, where I am, which is quite heavily male-dominated. I mean, it's outside of my own life and my own experience. I mean, there's still so much work to be done before we can actually say that men and women are given the same economic opportunities in the labour market as each other. So I think that it's a field, so gender economics is sort of the name of the field, which is incredibly interesting and incredibly important. I've been interested to keep up to date with sort of the research that's coming out of the field. It's quite illuminating, I think.
Yeah, I think we might actually be best off if we just immediately jump into talking with our expert. As you guys know, Sarah and I, we are in behavioral science. We're not gender economists. Hell, I'm not even an economist to begin with. So rather than dragging this on for another 5 minutes, although I'm perfectly happy to keep talking, I think it might be for the best, with regards to this episode, if we just dive into it. So Sarah, who is our expert for today?
So today we are very lucky, seeing as we're both, obviously, as you can tell, quite naive about the topic of gender economics. We are going to be talking with Johanna Rickne, who is a professor at the Swedish Institute for Social Research at Stockholm University. She is also a part-time professor of economics at Nottingham University, where I am based. And she's done some incredibly interesting research over the years. I think in 2020 of this year, she has actually published a couple of fascinating papers, which we'll be talking about. So, Johanna, welcome to the podcast. So today on the podcast, we have Johanna here with us. Hi, Johanna. Thanks for coming on.
Hello, thank you.
The thing we do at the beginning of all of our conversations is ask our guests to give the listener a short introduction of who you are, where you're based, and what you're currently up to. So, Johanna, who are you?
So I'm a Swedish person, and I'm a professor of economics at Stockholm University, also part-time professor of economics at Nottingham University. And I do mostly research on the labor market, also a bit on political parties, mostly focusing on gender inequality, careers, families, and things like that.
Cool stuff.
All very interesting and important topics. So how did you get into research?
Yeah, I applied for the PhD program because my supervisor on my thesis suggested it, and I didn't really think of it before then, but to me it was a really appealing idea to remain in school but be paid to study, so that's why I jumped on the chance to apply.
You've published a lot of work recently focusing on topics of sort of gender discrimination, particularly in the labour market, so looking at gender quotas, sexual harassment, and sort of career relationship trade-offs. How did you get interested in these sort of topics? Were these topics that you were studying in your PhD, or how did you sort of get to studying gender economics in this way?
Well, I picked it because I was interested, obviously, but I can't really pinpoint a time when that interest appeared because it was just always around since I was a child, I think. I mean, I thought I was a very righteous little child, or maybe that's not the right word, but I thought many things in the world were unfair, like burning down the rainforest, that's a tragedy. Also, nurses, I was really upset that women nurses were earning so little money. I guess I'd seen that on TV, but that's something my mom tells me that, I mean, early on in life, I was very upset about that injustice. So it's hard to say where these interests come from, but it's not that I found it on the way. I mean, it was something that interested me for a very long time.
And you were supported by your supervisors and stuff to sort of start looking into these topics?
No, well, not actively, I guess. I started out doing macroeconomics, and then I switched, and then I drifted more and more towards gender topics. But I mean, I think this subfield has grown a lot in recent years, but at the time, there wasn't really anyone in my department who was focusing only on that.
What made you switch?
So macro at that time, it was, so this is, this number of years ago, most PhD students did structural modeling, DSG models. That's kind of what was available to me as a topic. And I started out learning about it and doing a little bit of it, but then I was disappointed that you never got to deal with the actual data. You didn't get to go out in the world and test something on data from the labor market or from some other setting. You got to construct the model, and then the answers you get is essentially how you construct the model itself. You can find out new answers that way for sure, but it's not like it's not like going out as a detective into the world and finding the truth, or uncovering almost in a more journalistic way, the way I feel about empirical like applied microeconomics is more you get to be a detective and find answers, which I didn't really feel about the structural equations modeling type of exercises.
So for you, gender economics then combines you actually actively seeking out practical and empirical data to a topic which I guess you could argue is more microeconomics based. At least it can be very, very individual, with an interest and a fairness angle to it. So I mean, for you, that would be best of both worlds then.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in Sweden, we have such great data for many things. It gives you possibilities to research things that are not possible to research in other countries. So that's also nice to be able to look into questions that many people are writing about, many people are interested in, and there are lots of interesting theories on, but where it's not really been possible to find any good data, then in Sweden, chances are that data is going to be there. And so you can really look empirically at some of these very theoretically interesting things.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think I've always been interested in these topics, and whenever I have an idea and start discussing it with someone, the first barrier we'd come up with is, okay, but where is the data? Who's collecting data, that can answer questions about experiences of sexual harassment, for example, sort of a really key or a common experience that a lot of women face, that can lead to some, very severe negative outcomes in the labor market and in other aspects of your life. But there's just sort of no data on the prevalence and the seriousness and sort of the forms of harassment that's sort of freely available. So, I mean, you say that that in Sweden there is data available, and it's pretty good data, but I think there's still a long way to go in terms of collecting data around sort of issues of gender equality, do you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of new data sources are becoming available in other countries. For example, the web scraping, collecting quantitative data from different sources where you didn't have quantitative data before. And that's something that can be done then for the internet, for anything that appears on the internet in any country, or for newspaper archives or different types of media. That's been really good. Also, I think some in the intersection between management and economics, more and more companies are agreeing to let researchers manipulate and do more lab type, or at least randomize different parts of their work process to measure gender equality outcomes. And that's also a nice way to generate data. But in terms of registers, the types of registers we have in Sweden, I haven't seen so much progress on that front. Maybe a little bit in Europe. And sure, the US censuses are becoming more like that. And US censuses and tax data are maybe becoming a little bit more available than what they were. But I mean, in the Swedish case of sexual harassment, they started measuring that in the late 1990s, and some of those archives, it's a valuable thing that it's hard to catch up even if you would start measuring it today.
Yeah. So, I mean, you recently published a paper looking into these sort of questions about sexual harassment, especially of women in management positions. So was it this data that you used in your paper?
Yes. Yes. But in that paper, we also did our own data collection in Japan and in the US. So we wanted to look at these three countries and ask the same research question in all three of them. So we used the Swedish data that already existed, and then we did our own new data collection in the other two countries.
One of the main sort of motivations for this paper is this idea of the paradox of power hypothesis. I was wondering, could you give us sort of an idea, what is the paradox of power hypothesis, and how does it sort of intersect with sexual harassment?
Sure. So in the early days of studying sexual harassment in the 70s, this problem was, most women who worked in the labor market had very subordinate positions. They were secretaries, for example, answered the phone, took notes. So in the firm, women held very subordinate positions, and sexual harassment the perpetrators were mostly men in management, or who were the supervisors of these women. So men with power harassed women with less power in the same workplace, and that's really how theories came to understand this problem of victimization to sexual harassment. But then over time, of course, women started to gain more power in the workplace, and since the theories framed exposure to violence as a problem of having too little power, the idea was that, so when women start getting more power, they're going to get away from that problem of sexual harassment. But that's not what happened. Instead, what's turned out to be the case is that, yes, women are harassed when they hold subordinate positions, but they're also harassed, and even more so when they start climbing the career ladder to take at least the early, the first mid-level supervisor positions. You see exposure to sexual harassment go up, and then it goes down a little bit on the top positions, but it doesn't really go below. the average for the lowest positions. So this is what the paradox is. You would think that power would protect women, like power in the workplace would protect women from sexual harassment. But right now, the situation we have is that when women get power, they're actually harassed more, not less.
So as you mentioned before, you've collected data from Japan and Sweden and the US. So you had 3 samples, which culturally are quite far apart. Were there any important cultural differences, or is this a very stable effect?
Yeah, so no doubt there's very big differences between the 3 countries in terms of awareness of what sexual harassment is and levels of harassment as well. But in terms of this difference between supervisors and subordinates, we found a very stable effect in all 3. So women who climb to the first positions of influence in the workplace are harassed more than others by between 1/3 to twice as much.
Oh, that's a lot.
And how did you get a measure of harassment? What sort of dimensions of harassment did you think about including? And how did you create your own data, particularly in Japan and the States?
Yeah, so luckily in other disciplines, mostly psychology, there's been lots of work in looking at, like, asking women and also men about their experiences and then grouping up these experiences of harassment of a sexual nature into, like, doing typologies. So earlier research has done typologies of typical behaviors and grouped them into mostly into 4 different categories, and then within each one of those 4 categories there's a list of behaviors, and the survey instruments that are considered the best ones give people a list of behaviors and ask, in the last 12 months did you experience blah 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 behavior from your supervisors or colleagues, and then people answer yes, no, and also maybe frequency to all of these. And that's called a list-based survey instrument that just measures on a list if people were exposed to one of those items. So just to summarize what they are, is physical, sexually hostile and unwanted physical behaviors like groping. It can be unwanted sexual behaviors but psychological, like crude conversation or sending pictures or staring at someone in a sexual way. Or it can be sexist hostility, which is sometimes called gender harassment. It's more hostile and aggressive comments about men or women in general, or men's or women's ability to do a specific job. And then the final category is called sexual coercion, and that is a quid pro quo situation that's related to these physical behaviors. So maybe unless you do this with me, I'm not gonna put you up for this promotion or something like that. So essentially you just give people this list and then you measure, did people experience any of all of these things? And then separately, you also ask them, were you sexually harassed? And that's called that's a subjective question. Yeah, so regardless of how we measured, there was more sexual harassment of the supervisors. They score higher on each one of these psychological, physical, gender harassment.
And this paradox of power hypothesis, did you find any evidence of similar trends for men in terms of positions of power and degrees of harassment faced?
So yeah, the theory only talks about women, that specific theory, but I mean, it should, I guess, apply to men as well. So in the US and in Japan, we only asked women, but our Swedish data has both men and women. And we don't see any difference between men who hold supervisory positions and those who don't. So there's no indication of this type of effect for men in the Swedish data, at least.
Okay, so given that it's such, well, it's quite clear an effect that works for women then, but why? Well, what is driving this effect? What is driving the paradox? Or what in general is driving the idea that as soon as a woman has power, now apparently she deserves, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, even more sexual harassment than before?
Yeah, so one thing that seems to be happening comes out of the pure organizational context that women leaders are in. So think about someone who works in a work unit at the lowest level of the organization. They might spend time with their colleagues, sit there, for example, if they do sales, sit around with the other salespeople. But then imagine someone who becomes the head of that sales team, or maybe even a middle manager. That person has to go to meetings with all the top managers, and they now interact with the top part of the hierarchy of the organization. So when we ask questions about the perpetrator, who was it that harassed you, it was apparent that the women middle managers were harassed also by the top managers in the firm, and that's very uncommon for the women at the lowest hierarchical level.
Okay, so it's almost women holding positions of power, of sort of middle management. There's just more opportunities for them to be harassed by their colleagues. In a sense, if it's a game of numbers, if 5% of people engage in sexual harassment, then the more people you're exposed to, the more harassment you're more likely to experience.
Yeah, and the top part of the organization is going to have more men in it, so naturally you're going to be exposed to some more people that are of the opposite sex. But then we also have, in addition to that, norms. There could be norms-based additional explanations where there's a lot of research on the catch-22 that comes with women who behave assertively. So when women act assertively and have power and lead other people, they can be perceived in a very negative light. So experiments where you have videos of men and women acting in the same way. Women who act assertively, they can be seen as competent, but they're seen as very unlikable at the same time. So there's a double bind for women in leadership because they break gender norms on how women should act. That's seen in a negative light. So breaking gender norms, I mean, in the sociology theory and also in economics, and how identity economics works, is that triggers an incentive to retaliate. So people can use sexual harassment to retaliate against people who break gender norms to make them stop that behavior. So that's harder for us to test, but for sure, theoretically, it would make sense. Like it would go well together with the management and business literature that talks about this catch-22 and what happens with women in leadership.
Are you thinking about doing any future research, sort of trying to investigate this sort of norms mechanism a bit more experimentally?
Yeah, not necessarily. What we're researching right now is impacts on recruitment and worker motivation and productivity from how firms handle sexual harassment cases. And so there's a lot of research that ask women who have reported, and also men who have reported sexual harassment, like what happened afterwards. And the by far most common thing is that the company is going to trivialize, just ignore the complaint, or they're going to retaliate against the person that complains, maybe even fire that person. And meanwhile, the perpetrator usually doesn't get any negative consequences. So we already ran an experiment on the attractiveness of firms, just asking people where they would like to work in a conjoined survey experiment type of way. And it's very clear that people seem to care a lot about whether firms have handled sexual harassment cases firmly. So, but now the next step would be to try to see what happens to the workers, or see if we can simulate that situation somehow to see how firms' handling of this misconduct matters for productivity and turnover and other things.
That's really interesting, particularly because I think the role of the institution where sexual harassment is taking place is really important. Institutions can either make the PTSD and abuse much worse, or they could also be a source of justice and support. So the response of the institutions is massively interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating.
And it's possible that firms are underestimating how much people really care about these things.
Yeah.
So finding out the true cost to workers from not just the person who's harassed, but the wider organization. Yeah, because there was a recent study about toxic workers. And to me, it was very interesting because it pointed out that, yes, if you have someone who's very important to the firm, and maybe they're a star in the workplace, they're perceived as having lots of talent and be very important, but they might misbehave and they might be protected. There's a larger chance that the workplace is going to look the other way when one of the big superstars acts in a bad way. So what this paper was arguing was that it's even worse, it's even more important to handle that type of misconduct like assertively and transparently, because otherwise they can really create a toxic culture for the entire workplace.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting.
I don't have a very quick question about, so I didn't realize who was actually the sample who then went on to value certain companies and how likely they were to work there, how much they wanted to work there based on how sexual harassment cases were handled. But was this people in general, or was this predominantly women? What is that sample?
Yeah, so in that sample, we used an alumni MBA sample via Yale University. So at that, they have people from that school, but also in a network of, I think, that's 25 different business schools around the world. So their MBAs go out into the workforce, and it's an interesting sample because it's people that are in these high profile, like high income business occupations, where turnover of workers is very costly, like hiring costs and recruitment costs are a big part of business costs. So we did the survey experiment on them. And they said that they would, the way you do the experiment is lets you measure the wage equivalent of different types of work conditions. So you could say that avoiding, like rejecting a workplace that has protected a perpetrator of sexual harassment instead of punishing that person is equivalent to a 20% wage cut. Like they're willing to take a lower pay job just to not work in a firm like that.
Fascinating. So I've gone down a bit of a tangential route, but is that a project that's sort of finished and will be published hopefully soon, or is it still in the works?
No, this is ongoing, and we're thinking about how to create these simulate the, like how we're going to try to structure the investigation of how productivity of existing workers is shaped by the handling process of sexual harassment cases. So that's an ongoing effort.
Given your research experience you now have with this topic, what would you say is the it's not a nice question, I'm already apologizing for it, but what would you say is the best way to actually reduce sexual harassment that is specifically targeted towards female leadership? It's not a nice question, I know.
Yeah, to some extent you could imagine having more women leaders would help, because in that way, one of the reasons, at least what we find, is that the women, like when women step up in the hierarchy, they are exposed to more men around them. I mean, there's just more men in the top of the hierarchy of the firm. So if there would be more women on those positions, I would assume that, that culture would become less prevalent. But I mean, in general, I think, what underpins the norm that women in leadership is an anomaly that strikes people at something out of the ordinary that bothers them a little bit. I think that culture comes at us from all sides, from media, from lots of different places. I mean, little children already at 5-6 years old, they already connect intelligence with men. Yeah. And so we need to work, I think, on all ages, just creating less prejudiced images of men and women in leadership throughout society to make it something that's more natural in people's eyes, and avoid the sexualization of women minorities.
And I don't know whether you looked at this in this paper particularly, but did you find any intersectionality between harassment and women of color, sort of other minority groups, were they victims of more severe or more higher quantities of harassment than their peers?
Yeah, so in that paper, we don't do a lot of that in the paper, because in Japan there's very, very few ethnic or racial minorities to look at, so there wasn't really an opportunity to compare the countries. In the Swedish case, for men, like in another paper, we look at men's sexual harassment more across the whole labor market, and also women's sexual harassment across the whole labor market. And you see men being sexually harassed. Men actually in the Swedish labor market, some men are exposed to a lot of harassment, and those are in women-dominated occupations and workplaces, and it's especially men from outside of the OECD. So ethnic minority men who work in these women-dominated occupations, maybe mostly elderly care. It can be childcare, personal care assistants. So there's certainly an intersection, and in Sweden it's stronger for men than for women.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's not really something you expect. I mean, as soon as you think of sexual harassment, you tend to think of, a poor, relatively, well, not poor as in like financially, I mean, also possible, but of someone of a female, younger, of lesser financial wealth, of lesser opportunity, compared to a man who is of the ethnic majority, with much more wealth, with much more opportunity, obviously with much more power. At least that is the stereotype. I think to some extent it's also important to get rid of that stereotype, because obviously it excludes other people from claiming to have been sexually harassed, whereas that would be a very valid claim. Because I think when it comes to sexual harassment, most people don't assume that men can even fall victim to that, which of course is very damaging.
Yeah, and the fact that men are harassed so much in women-dominated. I mean, when I presented that paper to academic audiences in universities, some men express a lot of surprise and say that, I mean, and when we do survey experiments on how people feel about sexual, like how would you feel about working in this firm that has sexual harassment, we get the comment that, but men can't really answer that question because they've never been harassed. So how can they even answer that question? And then, I mean, yeah, I think it's hard. It's one of the problems that come, like one of the problems of solving this particular workplace hazard is that it's hard to understand what it means if you haven't been subject to it.
Right.
But men in these women-dominated industries, they know what it is. They've been subject to it a lot. So even among men, it can be really hard to understand what's going on in different groups.
Yeah. So I guess it's this empathy gap. If in
Yes.
men who have always worked or always been in sort of male-dominated environments, if they've never experienced it, they can't have empathy. They can't. If we think about who designs policy or who makes key decisions in firms, if they've never experienced it, how are they going to be able to make decisions with that in mind?
Yeah, and they might never have spoken to anyone who had the experience. So when we do the experiment on which firm you would like to work in, conjoint survey experiment where we list wage, different work conditions, etc., and we have incidents of sexual harassment with different sex of the victim and perpetrator. One very clear result is that people really don't want to work in a firm where a person of their own sex was the victim of sexual harassment, but neither men or women care so much about a firm, like they don't see it necessarily as a negative when a person of the opposite sex was harassed. And
so you're just looking out for yourself.
Or it can be hard to understand really what, like, you don't necessarily feel that it's such a big workplace problem for you if someone of another group is facing this issue. But then when we divide that, like we also ask them in a survey question if they know personally about any cases of sexual harassment in firms in their industry. So that lets us separate people who have maybe talked to someone in the past. They know about a case of sexual harassment from someone they know. And among them, there's a huge disutility from taking a job in a firm with sexual harassment. But for people who they don't know any case, so presumably if they've never talked to a victim, they are wholly indifferent to working in a firm where there's been sexual harassment.
Wow.
Yeah, so this information and finding out, it seems like it's really key.
So it is very important to raise awareness, and it is very important to have the stories of the victims come out. So, I mean, of course, it is for a lot of victims, I can imagine it is very difficult and very traumatizing to talk about, but it does indicate the value of their story, because the more people know of a story, of sexual harassment of either gender, of either a minority or majority, that will make it much more salient, that will make you much more likely to empathize, and as such, judge accordingly a company or people that do actually condone it.
And I think maybe some part with the Me Too movement, obviously that was extremely good for this particular point. But still, I feel that some kinds of sexual harassment are really better understood. Like most people can understand groping. Yeah, that would be awful. But when you look at studies on impacts and the type of stress and health problems that comes with sexual harassment, yes, groping and even up to like severe physical assaults, that's very harmful for sure. But something else that's also harmful is the slow drip of gender harassment, where people make comments that, for example, for men in a kindergarten, could be comments relating to men. They don't really know how to take care of children, haha. Or I hear sometimes among women economists that, oh, but we have the bell curve. Women are just not as intelligent as men. So like hearing these comments about your sex not being appropriate, or these comments about men or women in general, what these health studies show that over time, as these incidents accumulate, what you end up with is an equally large health problem as for the single other types of physical. And I think that's less understood, what happens with the daily, sense of isolation that can come from this feeling of belonging to an inferior group of workers or something like that.
So this is much more insidious.
No, yeah, but at least less understood. So if you go into a workplace or someone says, if I would say to someone, oh, someone told me this and this about women economists, it'd be like, yeah, that doesn't sound so bad. You just don't talk to that person anymore. Sure. But what happens when you're in a workplace where you know that people have that opinion and it keeps coming out time after time after time? I mean, yeah, I think in my opinion, at least, there's a gap there in understanding, and we need, I think, maybe some more research on how those environments undercut productivity and networks and various resources that people need to really be productive in that job, right?
So do you think that this is an issue that just needs more education? So people need to learn, that harassment doesn't just look like what we think harassment looks like, or do you feel like courses like unconscious bias training that seems to be quite popular the last couple of years, how much can unconscious bias training do, I guess, to sort of trying to bridge the empathy gap? I mean, I guess I'm just asking your opinion in a sense of whether or not you think it works. Is it sufficient, or do we need something a bit more in depth, do you think?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of critique out there against unconscious bias training. And I don't think there is a lot of good research on that evaluates the efficiency of it. So for sexual harassment, there's some interesting training programs, though, that are, I mean, it's a flavor of the same programs, I guess, but they can focus, for example, on victim storytelling. So hearing victims talk, kind of filling this function that I talked about of hearing of other people's cases. So there are those elements of creating among the bystanders who aren't necessarily at any risk of harassment themselves in that workplace, create a bigger understanding of what a potential victim would go through, and then also train them in terms of practical things to do. So if you see someone doing this, you should do blah, blah, blah. Because sometimes you don't know how to act. You see something going on that you don't really agree with, but it's not clear to you maybe how you would act in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that these bystander training programs can do potentially.
Yeah, I think more research maybe needs to be done, but it's an interesting to think about how you might design education programs or information campaigns to bridge this empathy gap.
Yeah, and that goes for different types of racism, maybe ageism, understanding of hostility towards minorities, bisexual orientation, these very harmful but not easily detected problems in the workplace.
Yeah, I can see that the applications for this would be vast. They'd be huge. Future research.
And I guess speaking of future research, what do you think are the most interesting research questions that have sort of yet to be asked and answered in the field of gender economics? What do you think the frontier is, and what do you think would be interesting to investigate next?
Yeah, this is such a hard question. As I said before, people are doing more and more work within companies and collaborating with companies to set up experiments to look into promotions or productivity or other things based on maybe how groups are, who works with who in a group, what tasks do women and men get within those groups, how does the process look over time, where some people gain more self-confidence within a group and other people don't. Some people end up getting more qualified for promotions from that group, and some people kind of stall in their career. That borders, as I said, to management studies, but I think that's an interesting thing that economists are working more at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one thing that I mean, with this sexual harassment and sexism in the labor market, to me, that's a very important topic, and that could certainly be investigated more. And it's different to how the previous literature has thought of work conditions as something that men and women have different preferences for, and then you get compensated. So if I want a more flexible job that allows me to work part-time, I have to accept a bit lower wage to get that part-time option. Essentially, men and women want different things, and that's why women end up with lower wages. Mm-hmm. So what we're saying is that, well, you can be discriminated in your work conditions, so you don't get compensated for someone being sexist to you. That just makes some jobs more costly to others, and it creates this trade-offs and wage gaps. So that, I think, is seeing work conditions as part of discrimination. Like we know a lot about wage discrimination, for example, but not a lot about discrimination from the work conditions. So that's also something that we're trying to look more at.
Well, for a very difficult question, that was a very good answer.
Thank you.
I was about to say, I am well impressed, and I am well eager to read that research when it comes out.
And I guess before we wrap up, if the sort of the listener wants to follow your research and sort of keep up with what you're doing, do you have sort of an online presence you would encourage people to follow you or get in touch with you in any way? Or you could also say, please no one contact me at all. That's also fine.
No, Johanna, I need to know, where can I stalk you?
I mean, Twitter is maybe the best place for that. So just my first name, last name. And then I have a web page where I just put all the new papers, and if anyone is interested, they can email for sure, or my contact information is on the webpage.
I guess that's it for this episode. Thank you so much, Johanna, for taking the time to speak to us today.
No, thank you so much.
And it was really insightful. Just great to talk to you about your research. I think it's really important and exciting, and I can't wait to see what you publish next.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Johanna. It was great to have you on the podcast. I thought that we were able to cover so many interesting topics, so many interesting papers that were recently published. Merle, what did you take away from the episode?
I mainly took away that I need to watch out for the paradox of power. If I ever make it beyond the stage that I'm in now and I move on to middle management or even higher management, I mean, pray for me, that I will face a lot more people, predominantly men, and that might lead to being exposed to much more different forms of harassment, whether it's sexual or not. So that's something I can prepare myself for. I always thought if you go higher up the ladder you can hide behind your power, but apparently you can't, which is great.
Yeah, it's actually super interesting that we're able to actually identify this effect, because I think a lot of the time when it comes to sexual harassment, we are talking about people's experiences. And I think that a lot of people who maybe don't think that sexual harassment is a problem anymore, or veer on the side of you're overreacting, or are you sure that this is actually what happened, very easy to dismiss sort of experiences as real evidence that sexual harassment takes place, and the sort of the form of harassment and the results of harassment. So yeah, I think it's really powerful actually that we can examine these type of questions through a quantitative lens, because unfortunately a lot of people will only listen to or interpret data as evidence when it is in this quantitative format.
That's true.
Yeah, so I think it's incredibly powerful, yeah, especially this paradox of power hypothesis, because it is true, or we have this understanding that actually a lot of sex is just power.
Mm-hmm.
And so sexual harassment is just a result, not just, but partly a result of this sort of exerting power over someone else, a gendered way of exerting power and making someone feel uncomfortable. It's interesting for that conception to be shaken a little bit.
I thought it was interesting, though, that, I mean, as Johanna mentioned, this effect actually backfires if, or not backfires, but this you can change this phenomenon around if you are a man. However, you are still a minority on the work floor. So we talked about nursing, for example. I think it's really interesting. So the fields that we're going into are becoming more and more equal. So we might, as a result, be exposed to less sexual harassment, although those that came before us as women, but also as the minority within the field, will have experienced it in our stead, which is also great. But I just find it, I don't think funny is the right word, but I find it interesting that if you're looking at men who are in predominantly female occupations, and that is not a value judgment, that's just a factual assessment, that this still happens. So this is not predominantly all men are bad, power hungry perverts. Sorry guys, but this happens also if women are in the majority. So we're all terrible people, which is, it's sobering, it's depressing, but I just very interesting that this still happens.
Yeah, and incredibly illuminating this proposed mechanism of sort of norm deviation, or sort of punishing people who are deviating from their sort of gender normative expectations. I think that's fascinating. And when you think about it like that, you think, well, actually, under that lens, why can't men, be harassed as well? Obviously, maybe there are just more male-dominated industries than there are female-dominated industries, and that's part of the reason why we don't hear so much about, as you said, men being sexually harassed in female-dominated industries.
I think it's also quite. I think it's difficult to establish for a lot of people, like you already said, what harassment actually is. So when you think about sexual harassment, I mean, your mind goes to like the worst occurrences first. Whereas and I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm saying it's statistically less likely, so don't come at me. It is much easier for a man to physically assault a woman, given that they're, of similar ages, I'm not talking about children here, I'm talking about grown adults. In that case, it's much easier. Yeah, on average, exactly. It is much easier for a man to assault a woman than the other way around, because men tend to be stronger. This is not something I like to admit either, but I think the average man is probably stronger than I am, which is, not nice, that does keep you up at night. But so if you're thinking about predominantly physical violence or physical-based sexual harassment, you think of a man attacking a woman. And then if that is the initial thought that you have, being able to see it the other way around, when a cutesy little lady is trying to attack like a bear of a guy, that is just not something that crosses your mind, although it is most definitely possible. But that sexual harassment will look different. And I think because there's such a stereotype on men being much stronger and women being these, dainty little damsels in distress, these flowers ripe for the plucking. I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this. Sorry. I've heard it said to me before, and I was then like, I am going to remember that for the rest of my life. If that is the dichotomy that you're working with, how on earth is a little flower sexually harassing a bear?
Yeah.
That's not possible in that schemata of reasoning. It's not. So I suppose it is maybe difficult to recognize that as a man you are being sexually harassed, or even assault. I mean, assault is pretty clear, I think. But I think even if it happens, we are aware of women being very ashamed to come forward because they think they are going to be blamed for what happened, that they can't prove what happened, and that they're going to be slut-shamed.
Yeah.
But they are still more likely to be believed than a man, I think.
Yes. Yeah, and it all comes down to there's so many intersections of sort of toxic masculinity and, not appearing weak. And actually, you should be happy that someone's making sexual advances on you. That's the sort of assumption that's that we
even worse reasoning. Oh, at least be happy someone wants you. Yeah, in a non-consensual way, that's not at all what you want.
And I think there's the key word in this sort of sexual harassment is unwanted.
Yeah.
Sexual advances. And I think that I'm saying I think a lot, but okay, I don't have the data in front of me. But it's one of those things where, because there is a bit of an empathy gap, if you've never experienced sexual harassment, you don't know what it feels like to be in a situation where you do not want, the sexual advances or the sort of the sexual subtext, and you feel that you can't say anything because there are going to be costs to you speaking out, and if it's your boss, of sort of saying no, please leave me alone. Like there is a sort of ingrained fear that it's very hard to communicate when you talk to people about these experiences. A lot of people are like, why don't you just get up and leave? Or why don't you just say, sorry, I'm not interested?
Yeah, but there's also the general idea that apparently a lack of consent is someone's very clearly saying no. I think a lack of consent is someone never having said yes or not having said yes in the moment. If someone is not screaming, yes, do it to me in the moment, probably don't do it.
Jesus Christ. Oh my God, as a British person.
I'm trying to make a bit more light of this. I'm sorry, Ukraine, but I'm trying to make a bit more light of this conversation. Not that it isn't a very grave and important topic, but it's a grim topic to talk about because we know it happens, and it happens a lot more frequently than expected, or than people want to admit to themselves. But consent is important. A lack of a no is not consent. And sexual harassment at the end of the day is not someone, being overcome with desire and not being able to control their urges. Sexual harassment is a form of domination, humiliation of the other, and feeling that you can get away by exerting power. And that is not a crime of desire, that is a crime of aggression. And that should just not be condoned. And the fact that this happens, even if to women, even if they can't hide behind power, I find really, really odd. I find depressing. And there's nothing positive to say about that.
I think the only positive is that this research is being done, and that you can see these very clear results that are backed up by some really impressive and robust sort of methodologies. I think one of the biggest barriers to sort of having more research, investigating these sort of topics and investigating, paradoxes of power and our, beliefs, preconceptions about where and who and why sexual harassment happens is just the data availability. No one is really collecting this data. And so it relies upon, I guess, either people going out and trying to collect data by themselves, which is, I think, what Johanna and her co-authors did in Japan and the US, or, I don't know, trying to, encourage, people who collect data like the ONS to incorporate these sorts of scales and data. And I mean, this is just from a quantitative perspective. I know there's a lot more research that's been done by qualitative researchers, which I think is incredibly important and, and incredibly valuable. And obviously there's going to be elements of people's experiences that are not going to be able to be picked up by quantitative measurement tools. So both sort of qualitative and quantitative approaches to this type of research are incredibly valid, but at the moment, there is a big barrier to doing any quantitative research, which I think is criminal.
I think a lot of people who are predominantly in quants struggle to interpret the importance, but also the implications of doing qualitative research. I don't think qualitative research is particularly easy, and because it offers such a variety in responses from participants who objectively have gone through a similar experience, if you don't mind me expressing it like that. It's making the field very muddy or very muddled. It's just very unclear how to approach that type of research, and I think that this is a reason why a lot of people stay away from it.
Yeah, I mean, it's about training and epistemologies and sort of, what is the goal of the research? In quants, everything is to measure and compare and control. But I mean, what I would say of the qualitative research that I've seen, there are some really clear themes and shared experiences that can be picked out, which I found quite surprising, that sort of suggest actually a pattern of behavior and a pattern of responses. So, for example, within an organization or an institution, if someone becomes the victim of sexual harassment, who do they report it to first? Actually, when through interviewing people who've had this experience of trying to report their sexual harassment, there's a really clear pattern of, for example, in universities, people go to their head of school. They go to the head of school first, right? Because there is this like all of this cognitive processing that's going on of sort of, okay, I need to disclose this to someone who is more powerful than the perpetrator. Right? So, for example, if the perpetrator was within your department, so you need to go to someone who has power within that department, but who is above the perpetrator. You've got to try and deal with, okay, well, I don't want to maybe talk to any of his peers because they could be friends and they could then tell the perpetrator. So that, and through a lot of this sort of the similar reasoning and sort of similar barriers, people end up going to the head of school is what they found. And actually, no, you would only know that from, I guess, qualitative research at this point, because there is no quantitative, data collection that's going on that's asking people this particular question. And I think with qualitative research, you go in not necessarily knowing what the important questions are to ask, but through that investigation, you can start to think, okay, well, this was very important to lots of people, like who they reported to. And actually, we see very, very similar actions on the other end. So then there you go. That can help you shape and build more measurement tools, right, based on this qualitative research. Anyway, qualitative research rant done.
No, it's a good point, and it's making a good argument for applying more qualitative measurement or just in general any type of qualitative methods to this type of research, especially if it is quite unexplored, which I think this field still is to a certain degree. I think this is it for us today. Quite a controversial topic, quite a topic that probably doesn't sit that nicely with a lot of people. But if this doesn't sit nicely with you, you should maybe ask yourself why. Have a little introspection session. Normally, we ask you to sound off on our socials to share your stories of, the phenomenon that we've discussed. But given that this information, if you have been sexually harassed, is quite highly sensitive, we won't ask you to do that. I also don't want you to perpetrator shame or victim shame anyone on the social media. So I think we're going to leave the social media out of it today. If you have ever been sexually harassed, or if you know of someone who has been, we will have a couple of links in the description of our podcast on every platform that we have to link you just to guidelines on how to deal with it or how to help someone else out, because this is very important, and the victim should never be left on their own, and it should be taken seriously, regardless of whether you are a man or a woman or anything in between or beyond. It is never ever permissible. And it's a real downer to end on, but like, this shit's important.
Yeah, it's a bit of a dose of reality, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for everyone who stuck with us this far. We really appreciate you listening all the way to the end. And we'll be back next week with a new topic. So we hope that you'll join us for that discussion.
See you next week.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love, you're the one I wanna give to. Things that